Hey everyone, I am here with Dr. Paul Saladino. He is known for being on the carnivore diet and talking about it, and I have him on here to discuss the carnivore diet. Dr. Saladino, he's a medical doctor. He has been in health through a bunch of years. He spent 6 years actually traveling after graduating from university where he studied chemistry. And then he returned to academic studies after his traveling, and he became a physician's assistant, and then he started practicing cardiology before training in the University of Arizona and obtaining his MD. He has recently completed his residency at the University of Washington, and he is board certified in psychiatry and a certified functional medicine practitioner. When he is not researching connections between nutritional biochemistry and chronic disease, he can be found in the waters of Southern California in search of the perfect wave. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Joe. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the meat of things, shall we?
There's a little pun.
Unintended. Okay. So first of all, what got you into carnivore diets?
You know, I'll try to keep this answer succinct. It's kind of a long answer because it's my story. But, you know, I'm a doctor. I was a PA before this. And throughout my medical career, I've been really interested in understanding what's at the root of chronic disease. And Western medicine doesn't do a great job of asking that question or really understanding that. And I realized that pretty quickly. That was one of my greatest disappointments during my career as a PA in cardiology. And it was just that I was just handing out medications, and it wasn't for lack of intelligence or well-intentioned physicians that I was working with. It was just that the system isn't very good at asking that question about what's causing disease. So I became just more and more disillusioned, and I decided to go back to medical school. I got interested in functional medicine, which people may know is just a branch of medicine that is a little bit outside of the norm, but is becoming more and more accepted. And it's just trying to understand the root cause of an illness, the root cause of generally a chronic illness, looking at inflammation and polymorphisms in genetics, which you know all about, and toxins and gut flora. And it does that from kind of a scientific approach. And within that perspective, as I was in medical school and progressing through residency, I quickly became aware of the fact that food was one of these huge, huge levers in health, and that there was this potential for discordance or concordance between the food that we were eating and our genetics, the food that we were eating and who we were as people, our physiology. And that to me is probably the most fascinating aspect of what creates health and disease. And so throughout my medical training and medical school and residency, and even before I went back to medical school, this question of how humans are supposed to eat, how do humans eat for health? What kind of things can we do or not do in our diets that create health and disease? That's a fascinating question. And so, you know, I had my own health issues, which were minor but persistent. I've done a lot of different diets throughout my life. I had a vegan diet for about 7 months. Basically, my health issues have been pretty mild. I did a raw vegan diet about 14 years ago. When I was a runner, I lost 25 pounds of muscle mass and then gained it back. Before I got into the carnivore diet about a year ago, for the last 10 or 12 years before that, I was basically organic paleo strictly. My health issues were mainly eczema. I've always been atopic, meaning that when I was a kid, I had asthma. I kind of grew out of that, but I've always had a little bit of reactive airways. But you know, those two conditions, asthma and atopy, or asthma and eczema, often go hand in hand. And it's theorized they have to do with T helper 1 to T helper 2 balance, with a T helper 2 imbalance, et cetera, et cetera. So I've always been sort of atopic. And that has been my greatest struggle in terms of health outcomes for me. And I felt pretty good on a paleo diet. My body composition was better. I mean, I was able to gain muscle mass back. Like I said, I lost a lot of muscle mass on a vegan diet, and I gained the muscle mass back. I felt like my performance was pretty good, but I never really was able to get rid of eczema. And that was a bothersome thing to me. And it wasn't horrible, but I did have a couple of flares in medical school that were pretty bad. In medical school, I was doing a lot of jujitsu, and so I was on the mats, grappling and wrestling. And at certain times in medical school, for reasons that I could never really figure out, but were probably related to certain food intolerances in retrospect, I got some pretty bad eczema flares that would lead to pretty big kind of itchy rashes on my knees and elbows. And you can imagine rolling around on dirty mats or mats with other people, they would sometimes get infected and cause impetigo, a skin infection, etc. So the eczema became a problem in medical school at times. And once it got so bad that I became a little septic and feverish. So that was my main thing. But as I was going through, I thought, man, this paleo diet, I tried all sorts of variations of it. I thought, I think this is the best way to eat at the time. And my eczema never went away. It just never, ever went away. And I thought, there's got to be something else. I'm missing something. My immune system is still being triggered. I don't know if it's a toxin I'm being exposed to. I don't know if it's metals. I don't know if it's still a food. And so I went through basically every single iteration of paleo there was, whether it was autoimmune, low oxalate, low histamine, on and on and on. I was really trying to understand, yes, dairy, no dairy. Oh, dairy triggers me. I think chocolate.
And what year is this in?
This is throughout. So this is from about 2011 through 2015 when I was in medical school. And this even extended into residency. So in residency from 2015 to this year, well, about a year ago when I started the carnivore diet, I was still having the eczema and still experimenting. So it was probably over the last, 7 years that I was experimenting with those things and noting triggers.
Did you have any other issues besides eczema? Like, were you tired? Brain issues?
I didn't really have brain fog that I knew of. Interestingly, when I went carnivore, some things changed that I didn't even know were an issue, but I'll get to that. But at the time, I didn't really notice anything else. The eczema was the main thing. If I hadn't had eczema, I wouldn't have thought anything was wrong. I just knew that I still had autoimmunity. I still had something going on with my skin. And that was to me an indication that there was an imbalance. And if their skin was having an issue, the rest of my body was still there was something going on that was triggering me. So yeah, it was pretty focused for me. I wasn't incredibly sick, but
okay.
That idea of autoimmunity has really become my fascination because I think that autoimmunity and inflammation are at the root of chronic disease. I mean, that's a huge statement, but I think that it's true. And if we look at chronic disease, it's very difficult to find chronic disease in which the immune system is not overly activated or inappropriately activated. So autoimmunity is to me the greatest target in medicine, and understanding what causes, ameliorates, resolves, autoimmunity is a fascinating thing. So I was thinking about this eczema, doing all these diets, doing all these adjustments, never really getting rid of it. It kind of comes and goes. Maybe it's seasonal, who knows? And then I heard Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, and he said, my daughter had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, Michaela Peterson. I know she's been on your show. And he had some arthritic complications, probably some similar amounts of autoimmune arthritis. And he was talking about how he was doing this crazy thing called a carnivore diet. I didn't know anything about this. This was a little over a year ago. And his daughter's immune issues resolved and his immune issues resolved. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because throughout my medical career, I've been fascinated by case studies and even anecdotes. And I've studied vegan anecdotes because vegan diets sometimes improve autoimmunity in people as well. So it's pretty clear to me that elimination of offending foods is often the lever that we need to resolve inflammation and autoimmunity cases. And when Jordan said that, I thought that is fascinating. I should really think about that. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe plants are triggering autoimmunity in people. And then my next reaction was, that can't be right. That can't be true, because I'd been studying medicine and thinking about it from an integrative perspective and studying functional medicine. And within those realms of thinking, people are extolling the virtues of plants, and they're just talking about how valuable plants are for humans. And we need lots of plants, and we need all kinds of plant fiber for a healthy microbiome. And that's the answer. The answer is not that plants are causing an issue. The answer is that you're not eating enough plants. That's the party line. So it was very contrary to that. But when I looked into it, that was the beginning of my carnivore journey about a year ago. As I thought, you know what, that's interesting. I'm going to dig into it. And the rest is history. I mean, for about the last year, I've been just doing as much research as I could and digging deeper and deeper into this. And now I'm writing a book and I've got my own podcast. And what I've found has been frankly just mind-boggling and fascinating.
Wow, that's really interesting. What year did you hear Jordan Peterson talk about it? Was that 2017 or 2018?
Well, let's see. It's June 2019 right now. So it must have been in early 2018.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I I kind of went on a similar journey to you before, you were doing a bunch of different diets, but I kept on cutting out foods. So I was like, all right, let me just cut out more foods. And eventually my issues resolved. And I was like, so I called it a lectin avoidance diet, right? But, once the carnivore diet started to gain traction, I thought, let me talk about this as well. A lot of these things are similar, but there's different ways of talking about it, right? You could call it zero carb, right? Because you're not eating carbs. You could call it keto. You could call it the Atkins diet, if you will, right? But then there's variations because Atkins, let's say he allowed dairy. You can call it a carnivore. You can call it a lectin avoidance diet. I mean, basically there's a whole bunch of names that you can call, but what I find interesting is that, Jordan Peterson really gave it a lot of star power, I think, because if someone else were to just say like, oh, I only eat meat, they'd be like, all right, this guy's just a nutcase. You know what I'm saying? Right. But he already was like famous in an area. And so I think when he came out about it, I think it gave the, just really limiting your diet a lot of credibility.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify for people that what I think of as an ideal carnivore diet is not just meat. It's definitely something that we need to perhaps give another moniker to, like nose to tail carnivore diet. I'm pretty staunchly outspoken about not just eating meat, and this will answer many of the things that we'll probably talk about in this interview today about potential nutrient deficiencies on carnivore diets and the way that eating nose to tail and eating the whole animal really basically obviates most of those nutrient deficiencies. So I think that Jordan is an incredible academic and super brilliant. He's now eating liver, which is interesting. And so both he and Michaela eat liver. I've had a lot of conversations with Michaela. So they're eating more nose to tail now. But I think in the beginning when he came out on Joe Rogan, yeah, he was saying basically I just eat steak. And so people thought, wow, I can just eat meat? That's crazy. But it kind of makes a little more sense when you think about where we're getting nutrients from when we think about eating nose to tail. And if we're thinking about a calcium source and we're thinking about, oh, we should eat some bone meal and we should eat the animal nose to tail like our ancestors would have done. It seems maybe a little less radical to people, but that's just I'll frame the diet in that way. And we can talk about the details of how you would construct a nose to tail carnivore diet. But I agree with you completely about the verbiage. And I think that elimination of lectins is one of the powerful parts of a carnivore diet. I think there are other parts of it that are interesting as well, because you also get rid of things like oxalates and estrogenic flavonoids and all of the plant toxins. There are many plant toxins, in my opinion, beyond lectins, but lectins are a big deal. And I think for a lot of people, a lectin avoidance diet can be super beneficial. But yeah, Atkins, lectin avoidance, carnivore, they're very similar. They all have little differences, but they're very similar. And for a lot of people, they're very helpful.
So you hit on exactly what I wanted to ask you. And, one of the big issues, I'm a bit outspoken against the all meat diet because I think people can do it. It's just that you got to do it right. You got to plan it. You got to know what you might be deficient in. And the way you're doing it, I want to find out how exactly you're doing it. But just when you mention nose to tail, I already hear like we're probably going to agree on 95% of what we're talking about, because that really does solve a lot of the nutrient issues that one might be dealing with. You could do it that way, or you can do it just by supplementing with missing nutrients. That's personally what I do, but what you're doing is probably a more natural approach. I favor the approach that you're taking. You're being more cautious about it. You're making sure you're not deficient in things, but that's something I want to actually just discuss right now. What exactly is your diet like right now? And what do you eat? Because it's probably not a huge list.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a fairly simple list. And the only caveat that I'll recommend is that there are multiple ways to create a nose to tail carnivore diet that don't look exactly like my diet. I'll tell you how I eat in detail, but for people that are listening, if they want to create a nose to tail diet, there are lots of permutations that would accomplish the same thing as what I do that may be a little easier or a little less constricted. I'm the type of person that I enjoy simplicity and I enjoy eating the same foods day in and day out. They're satisfying to me, but I don't want to turn people off to the fact or make people think that the way I eat is the only way to construct a proper nose to tail carnivore diet. I do think, as you suggest, that if people are going to do a carnivore diet, which I would think is a really good idea or a very viable way of functioning at a very high level as a human, they should do so in a very intentional way and think about where they're getting all the nutrients they need. And I too am concerned about all meat or exclusively ribeye diets, because the potential nutrient deficiency list as long as you guys have illustrated on Self-Hacked. So the way that I eat right now, I get up in the morning and I drink a big glass of water with some electrolytes. So one of the things that people notice in ketogenic diets is that they get a lot of salt wasting. And I don't think anybody understands why we have natriuresis of fasting, but we do. And so in the morning, I get up and have a big glass of spring water with a pretty good amount of salt, maybe 2 to 3 grams of sodium chloride, like Redmond sea salt, an inland sea salt that doesn't have microplastics. And then to that, I'll add a little bit of magnesium and a little bit of potassium. I think that I probably came into a carnivore diet with a little bit of a magnesium and potassium deficiency. And I think that a lot of people on ketogenic diets end up wasting magnesium and potassium when they don't get enough salt. So the electrolytes are a relevant issue for people, and I think it's easily correctable. And it seems to be something that a lot of people have issues with. And it probably, in my opinion, has to do with the fact that we're not drinking spring water. You know, if we look at things like Gerolsteiner or Pellegrino or Topo Chico, they're much higher in things like magnesium and bicarbonate. And so they have other things. And we're also not drinking blood. And that's a really gross concept to most people. And I acknowledge that. But evolutionarily, I think we would have eaten meat that was much fresher, and we potentially would have been drinking blood. I mean, there's plenty of examples of indigenous cultures drinking blood. And I mean, if you think about it, blood is a pretty good electrolyte drink. It has a lot of sodium, a little bit of magnesium, and a little bit of potassium. And so there are ways that we would have gotten more electrolytes in ancestral diets. I don't drink blood now, generally speaking. I've had it before. It's pretty darn good. I just don't have access to it. So I'll get up in the morning and I'll have a big glass of water with some electrolytes. And then I tend to eat just breakfast and lunch. And then I do a time restricted eating window. Most days it works for me. A lot of carnivores find that they're so full after eating that they only want to eat twice a day. And that generally is what I find. And it's one of the nice things about carnivore. I'm not always thinking about food. So depending on the day, depending whether I'm, at the hospital or doing something, if I'm doing work at home or working on social media or doing a podcast, I'll generally eat breakfast like mid-morning. And for me personally, and again, this is just how I do it, but there are many ways to get all of your nutrients eating nose to tail. I will begin the day with a few duck egg yolks. I love duck egg yolks because they're super rich. And so I'll eat duck egg yolks. I usually eat about 3 duck egg yolks.
Regular egg yolks?
Oh, have you ever had a duck egg yolk?
I think so. Is that, would quail be considered a duck egg yolk?
No, quail is very small. Duck egg yolks are big and they're rich. They're much thicker. If you look at the nutritional composition of a duck egg yolk, it's about twice that of a chicken egg yolk. They're just more enjoyable. Duck egg yolks are just richer.
I've had emu egg yolks.
That's probably pretty good, man. I've had an emu. Is it a really big egg yolk?
Oh, it's massive.
Is it thick?
Yeah. You need like a hammer to crack it open.
Yeah, and with a duck egg yolk, actually, the yolk is so thick when I take it out of the refrigerator that you could almost cut the yolk with a knife, and it's not even cooked. It's more viscous. You can tell it's just richer in all of the good things in egg yolks, choline, cholesterol, all the nutrients. It's just a much richer type of egg yolk than a chicken egg yolk. So,
and where do you get that?
I get it from a local grocery store that has an organic set of ducks that they source it from. So it's a little tricky to do it, but you can find it where you are. But I mean, chicken egg yolks are fine. I've eaten a lot of chicken egg yolks in my life. I don't eat the white. And I'll tell you why. For me personally, I find the white is a little bit immunologically triggering. I definitely don't eat the white raw. Sometimes I'll do raw yolks. Any concerns about infection are on the shell of the egg. And so I don't really worry if I'm getting organic or locally pasture raised eggs about contamination. So sometimes I'll eat the yolk raw. Sometimes you could cook the yolk if you wanted to, but I don't generally eat the white, especially if I'm eating the egg raw. So I'll do yolks, and it could be chicken or duck, but if I can get duck, I will eat duck. Sometimes at the grocery store, they have like emu or ostrich, which would be even bigger and more amazing. But
Yeah, I've eaten an ostrich egg.
yeah, they're huge.
They're massive.
They're massive. And then I'll complement that with liver. And I see liver as just this incredible multivitamin, and it's quite complementary to the nutrient profile in the muscles. So if you look at muscle meat versus liver, there's some B vitamins in muscle meat. And if you're looking at the other complementary B vitamins, they are in the liver. It's quite interesting. There's not a lot of folate in muscle meat, but there's a good amount of folate in the liver. The same thing with zinc and copper. There's quite a bit of zinc in muscle meat, and there's a lot of zinc. There's a lot of zinc in muscle meat, and there's a lot of copper in the liver, and we know we need to balance those minerals. So I do, generally for me personally, what I found works best is about 5 ounces of liver per day. And I really enjoy that now. It took me a little time, but I will eat liver in the morning. So I'll eat liver and egg yolks, and then I will eat, and this is an important part of the way that I construct a carnivore diet, I will do a certain ratio of fat to protein. So I will eat liver and egg yolks, and then I will do meat and fat. And I really think that human biochemistry functions best when we are getting a robust amount of fat. I think there's a lower end to protein, which if we get too little protein, we can get muscle loss. So I don't want to get too little, but there's like a Goldilocks level for protein. Not too little, not too much. What I have seen in the carnivore community and what I've observed in myself previously is that if I'm eating a lot of protein, I'll see my fasting glucose rise, and I'll see my A1C creep up a little bit. So I generally have learned to titrate my protein intake to a fasting blood sugar. And what I want to see for myself is somewhere between 70 and 85 for a fasting blood glucose. In the beginning of doing a carnivore diet, I was doing maybe 3 pounds of meat a day. And my fasting blood sugar would go 95, 96. I never saw it go above 100, but I've definitely seen fasting blood sugars above 100 in carnivores. And I think, yeah, you probably should dial back that meat and dial up the fat for the fat to protein macro. So for me, for my first meal of the day, I'll generally eat about 8 to 10 ounces of meat, and I'll complement that with a lot of fat. And the way that I've found that I like to get the fat the best is from trimmings, actual real fat from the animal, because it also has connective tissue, which is another part of eating nose to tail, is getting the actual connective tissue of the animal, which is going to be collagenous and rich in glycine to complement the methionine in the muscle meat. So I love the pure fat, the trimmings from an animal, and I have a butcher, or you can order it online. I get grass-fed meat and grass-fed animal fat. And the meat, it generally is 8 to 10 ounces in the morning, plus, I would say at least 100, maybe 125 or 150 grams of fat. And that's amazing. And I usually use a lot of salt. I'm pretty liberal with my salt consumption. I think a lot of people on ketogenic and carnivore diets run into trouble when they don't use enough salt, and their body has to increase aldosterone and the mineralocorticoids to do salt conservation, and that causes us to waste potassium. So that's generally my breakfast. And so it's the electrolytes, space it out, egg yolks, liver, meat, and fat, and salt. And then I repeat, usually right now, I repeat the egg yolks and the meat and the fat for lunch, and that's what I eat in a day. So it's pretty simple, pretty basic, but I will also, at the end of the day, have a calcium source, which is either gonna be a bone meal or an eggshell. And I am careful to clean the eggshells really well so I don't get any contaminants. But one of the things that people on carnivore diets I think often lack is a calcium source. I'm not a fan of dairy. We can have a whole conversation about potentially immunogenic proteins in dairy and A1 versus A2 milk and all the studies that have been done with beta-casomorphin 7 and things like that. But I don't do any dairy, so I want to get some calcium somehow. And so that's my idea of how to eat nose to tail. Now, it can vary day to day, but that's the general template. If I have access to good bone marrow, I will eat some bone marrow. I sometimes do salmon eggs. I like seafood. If I have access to some really good salmon or other low mercury fish, I will eat that. If I have access to scallops, I will sometimes eat those. I just ordered these lamb testicles. They call them lamb oysters from US Wellness Meats. Sometimes I'll eat kidney. But there's a general template, and then I'll add in organs, occasionally. I've not been able to get brain yet, but I like kidney sometimes. I'm excited to try lamb testicles. I'll do bone meal. I'll do brain. So I'm trying to eat the whole animal. You can imagine, you and I are in a tribe, and we are out in the savannah or in the forest, and we kill a deer. We're going to eat the whole deer. We're going to eat the pancreas, and we're going to eat everything. We're going to eat the spleen, and there's unique nutrients throughout the animal as it compartmentalizes various nutrients in different places. And the bones are important, the organs are important, the muscle meat's important, the fat's critical, and the connective tissue is important. So that's how I do it. And it's simple, but not too simple. It's not just ribeyes.
Yeah, so listening to your diet, I already see that almost all the problems that can potentially come up in a carnivore diet are basically not issues. If we're talking about copper, it's not an issue because of the liver, and same with vitamin A, and then also other fat-soluble nutrients. I assume that it contains vitamin E?
Yeah, and if you look at it, before we got online, I actually did a podcast on my podcast this week, which is called Fundamental Health with Paul Saladino, MD. And I talked about a lot of the potential nutrient deficiencies on a carnivore diet that you guys and Chris Kresser had raised. And if you look at it, a pound of meat actually has about 15 to 20 milligrams of vitamin E, which is right at the RDA for vitamin E. So especially grass-fed meat. Grass-fed meat has about twice the amount of vitamin E as grain-fed meat. So people don't need to worry about getting enough vitamin E on a carnivore diet if they're eating, 3/4 of a pound of reasonably raised, hopefully grass-fed meat per day. Yeah, there's actually a pretty decent amount of vitamin E in meat. And then there's a little bit of vitamin E throughout the other places too.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, but for that, you definitely need to make sure you're getting grass-fed stuff.
The grass-fed stuff, interestingly, yeah, during the podcast, I talked about it. For some of the nutrients, the grass-fed meat has about twice the amount that the grain-fed meat does. Vitamin E, there was another nutrient I'm blanking off the top of my head, but we looked at it. Oh, I think for vitamin C as well, there's more vitamin C in grass-fed meat. And one of the things we can talk about vitamin C, because people will hear that and they'll say, oh, you're okay, maybe you can get all your nutrients, but what about vitamin C? So I'll just mention that vitamin C is actually present in pretty reasonable quantities in muscle meat. And as long as the muscle meat is fairly fresh, not like cured or jerky, and you don't overcook it, you can get a pretty decent amount of vitamin C in a pound of muscle meat. I think we estimate about 12 to 14 milligrams of vitamin C per pound. And
Yeah,
liver
but that's
is
not enough. You need 60 at least, and that's just the RDA. You probably want more than that.
We can talk about that. We can talk about 60. Liver is actually a very good source of vitamin C, and you can get about 30 milligrams of vitamin C per 2.5 ounces of liver. So, eating 5 ounces of liver, I'm probably getting 30 milligrams of vitamin C or 60 milligrams of vitamin C right there. But the RDA for vitamin C is a little funny, and I talk about this in the podcast. So the studies that have been done with vitamin C actually show that you only need 10 milligrams per day to prevent scurvy. And the name of vitamin C is ascorbic acid. So scorbutic is the term we give for scurvy. And so ascorbic acid means this is the substance that we use to prevent scurvy. In the studies that were done in the 1930s on conscientious objectors, which is a study that will never be repeated, they gave these people scurvy. It took about 6 to 8 months of depletion. And they were able to reverse scurvy with doses of vitamin C as low as 10 milligrams. And there was no clinical difference in the people who received 10 milligrams or 70 milligrams of vitamin C per day. Zero clinical difference. And if you look at the interventional trials with vitamin C, they've generally all failed to show any clinical benefits. So there's never been a study that I'm aware of that suggests that supplemental vitamin C is beneficial. And I think most people, it's possible to get scurvy if you have zero vitamin C, but I think that threshold is much lower than we believe it to be. And I think anything probably above 10 milligrams is fine for people. There's never been a study that I'm aware of that shows that there's a difference between 10 and 70 milligrams of vitamin C in inflammatory markers or oxidative stress. And in fact, what we see in most carnivores, very few of whom supplement vitamin C, is that the oxidative stress markers are essentially pristine. And I can talk about my oxidative stress markers. So I'm not convinced about the 70 milligram vitamin C threshold. If we were really worried about that, you could probably get that from a pound of meat and maybe 5 ounces of liver. So
that's the thing. You are consuming 5 ounces of liver and a pound of meat. So
yeah.
you are getting 70 milligrams or more of vitamin C.
Close. Yeah.
And so I think that's a bit of a different situation.
Yeah.
Whereas people who are getting less, I personally would be concerned. And the other thing is that I'd say that there are studies that show serum levels of vitamin C and the risk of dying or the risk of various conditions. And there is, there is something to say that the higher your circulating levels of vitamin C, the healthier that is, right? Now,
Well, let's talk about that for a moment
okay.
because that's a very interesting point. You're absolutely right. There are studies which are observational epidemiology that show that your circulating vitamin C has been connected with health outcomes. But when they go to do the interventional trials, they fail. And that to me suggests that we're probably looking at something else, that the vitamin C is probably a proxy for something else going on that these people are doing. And this gets into sort of the ideas of epidemiology. But if that were true, we should see benefit from supplementing vitamin C, and we don't. And if you look at the vitamin C interventional trials, generally not beneficial for people at all. So
That's
that's an
because
interesting
they're
point.
supplementing with people who are getting more than 60 or 70 milligrams a day already, right? It's people who are not who wouldn't be considered deficient.
Well, yes, but if you look at 60 to 70 milligrams of vitamin C, really won't push your serum levels of vitamin C that high. It'll give you very meager levels of vitamin C. But what they find in the studies is that people who have higher levels of vitamin C do better. And so they thought, okay, well, they're not talking about scurvy here. So they're saying there's something that people who are eating more vitamin C, it's either the extra vitamin C that's benefiting them, or it's something that they're also doing that's benefiting them. And so they try to recreate that by pushing their vitamin C level higher, and they don't see any benefit. So there's really, when they do the supplementation, there's no benefit. So I would argue that really suggests strongly that this is a marker for something else. It's a proxy. It's one of these healthy user biases. The people who have higher levels of vitamin C are probably people who do other healthy behaviors. And we can't say for sure that it's actually the vitamin C, because when we push the vitamin C levels up with supplements, no benefit.
Right. In my opinion, there's probably two reasons. I actually agree that most of it is probably a proxy for something else. And if I had to guess what it was a proxy for, I would say number one, the amount of plants people are eating, not even like grains. I'm saying more vegetables, right? And this is for people who don't have autoimmune issues or things like that. And so basically like vegetables are much higher in vitamin C, same with fruits. And there's a lot of studies that show fruits and vegetables are associated with lower mortality.
But
Even
those
when
are
you
also observational epidemiology, remember? So those are also
right. But they also
very
they also
strongly confounded. And we can talk about that. I would love to
yeah.
contrast some of those studies. If we really look in depth at the studies that show that vegetables are beneficial, that is entirely healthy user bias. There have been studies in Britain that show that when they remove the healthy user bias, that effect goes away completely. And what they did in those studies was they compared vegetarians with healthy behaviors to non-vegetarians with healthy behaviors, and they had the same mortality. So the vegetarian thing and the fact that people are eating more plants, I would argue that is a proxy for the healthy lifestyle behaviors: less smoking, more exercise, more sunlight. And though we can't say for sure, I would suggest an alternative hypothesis of the vitamin C is that rather than eating more plants, because there are very few plants that have any real amount of vitamin C, if you look at the data, like it's actually not that rich in plants. It's in citrus fruits to some extent, but it's probably a proxy for them doing more healthy behaviors. That would be my alternative hypothesis rather than the hypothesis they're eating more plants. But to suggest that there are studies that link clearly the consumption of plants with longevity, that's just observational epidemiology. There's never been a study that actually showed that clearly. And I would argue furthermore, the interventional trials, and we can certainly review these in detail if you'd like, the interventional trials that have been done with fruits and vegetables show no difference when people are supplemented with tons of fruits and vegetables, no difference in oxidative stress markers or DNA damage between lots of fruits and vegetables and zero fruits and vegetables. So the interventional trials really fail to show any oxidative benefit or DNA damage benefit. And the studies that do show a benefit in terms of mortality are observational, and I would argue strongly confounded by the healthy user bias.
So in terms of the healthy user bias, I think when the studies are done, they're definitely trying to take into account these confounding variables, right? Almost all studies will try to take into account smoking and a lot of other behaviors. So
They can account for smoking, but if you actually look at the epidemiology literature, they will admit pretty frankly that they can't control for healthy user bias. They just can't. And the UK Shoppers study really illustrates that. That's the study where they looked at vegetarians versus non-vegetarians with healthy behaviors, and there was a real difference. So in that study, vegetarians had a better standard mortality ratio than the general population in Britain, but when they compared the death rate ratio of the vegetarians to the healthy behavior non-vegetarians, they were exactly the same. And if you look across cultures to places where the meat biased, healthy user bias is not the same, like in Asian populations, you see the complete reverse. And this is really an indication of healthy user bias in the US, which is just simply the illustration that people who are eating more vegetables are also doing more healthy behaviors because we've been told that that is the healthy thing to do, and those associate with each other historically. But in Asia, eating meat is associated with affluence. The people that eat more meat in Asia live longer. So it's completely opposite in the United States, because the Asian narrative has never been, hey, you eat more vegetables, you're going to be healthier. The Asian narrative has always been, you eat more meat, you are affluent, you are healthier if you eat more meat. And you see the exact opposite in Asia. The highest living people eat more meat, and the people that eat the most meat, in men, it's associated with less coronary vascular disease, and in women, it's associated with less cancer. So the epidemiology is always confounded by these underlying things. And I think if you talk to an epidemiologist, they'll just admit to you, hey, we just can't control for healthy user bias. But you're absolutely right. They do try and control for smoking, but the other ones are so hard. How do you ask somebody about healthy behaviors like, going in the sun? And they can try, but they just can't control for these things.
yeah, they'll often control for income, because income is obviously one of the biggest
Yes.
factors for health, right? Even if you're unhealthy and you have higher levels of income, if you have a problem, often you can afford things. You're not forced to wait to take care of something, right? So I think income is very significant, and they do account for income. They account for smoking. I believe they'll account for like exercise. It all depends on the study, but most of the studies I'd say are accounting for the biggest variables. They're not accounting necessarily for every variable. There's always a possibility when you're trying to account for things that you're missing things, right? So I would say that, in my opinion, that would be an open question. I think it's a real rabbit hole in terms of really dissecting each study, looking at every aspect of the literature, and asking, okay, what did they account for here? What did they account for there? What are all the factors that maybe they didn't account for that would have an effect, right? And so I think that's a really big question that I don't think you can resolve in it's something that you can have an opinion on, but in terms of like actually figuring out the answer, I think that's a really complex question.
Yeah, and this kind of speaks to the idea that epidemiology studies are generally poor, and that unfortunately epidemiology studies are not used in the way that they should be. In nutritional realms, epidemiology studies should be used to generate a hypothesis, and then we should test the hypothesis by intervention trials. But generally what's happened is that we are making most of our dietary guidelines based on exclusive observational epidemiology. And that's why interventional studies like the ones that are done with fruits and vegetables are so interesting to me, because, to reiterate, when we actually compare groups of people who are eating lots of fruits and vegetables in an interventional controlled trial to people who are not, we somewhat surprisingly, although it depends on the perspective that you take, it's not incredibly surprising to me, somewhat surprisingly to the general population, see no improvements in oxidative stress measured in multiple ways, and no improvements in DNA repair or damage markers. So that's the problem that I have with the whole issue.
So how
Yeah.
many studies are you looking at when, like, for example, I know you can
5.
find a study pretty much that says anything, not you, everyone, right?
Yeah, there are 5 or 6 studies like that I could cite. I can pull them up right now.
Out of how many total interventional trials with fruits and vegetables have been done?
I'm not familiar with any interventional trials with fruits and vegetables that have shown a positive benefit in terms of oxidative stress. I'm only familiar with the negative ones, but we never.
Okay, but what about other metrics, right? So
with
you're
fruits and
talking about
vegetables.
one metric, oxidative stress.
Oxidative stress and inflammation. So those are really, it's two measures: DNA damage,
And they're
oxidative stress.
measuring that with CRP.
They're measuring it with a variety of things. I can pull up the studies. They're measuring it with 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, endonuclease 3 sites, numerous measures. And I think
Okay,
they're measuring it with interleukins and other inflammatory
that
markers.
would be really interesting. So I don't think we can, going into the weeds of like the details of every study, that's probably beyond the scope of the podcast. But what I would like for you to do is send me all the links
Sure.
and we might make a post about it, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if it's true that there's only been 5 interventional studies done and on eating fruits and vegetables, and they've all come out as negative, as in there has been no benefit. That would be a very interesting post.
It is pretty interesting. Yeah, you should really look into it. I'll
But
just pull.
the thing that I would want to do is I'd want to make sure that we're not selecting the studies that we want, and we really do a comprehensive literature review. So the way to do that, so that's why I want to get your studies, and then I'll have one of my researchers do a comprehensive literature review, and we can see all the studies out there about it. And if it is the case that 5 out of 5 studies are showing no benefits with fruits and vegetables as an intervention, I will change my opinion.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. Yeah, I would love to see that post.
I will personally stop eating fruits and vegetables.
Well, I look forward to that day, my friend. It's pretty impressive.
For me, I look at the available evidence, and all the available evidence I see leans towards that there are health benefits to eating fruits and vegetables. Now, there could be some negatives to some people, especially fruits and myself. But if what you're saying is true, and it might be, right, I will change my behavior, right? So I'm very flexible.
Yeah, I love that.
And if I see evidence for what you're saying, I would change my behaviors.
Well,
Okay.
and similarly, I'm open to the opposite possibility as well. And you didn't have time to necessarily research this before our podcast, but are you aware of any studies that show the reverse of that, interventional trials with fruits and vegetables that actually showed a benefit in terms of oxidative stress?
I haven't done like a comprehensive literature review, right? So
Yeah.
it's more like I'll read something once, I'll read something here, read something there. And, it's just an overall impression that I get, right? That's why I would like to see all the studies that you have, and then have one of my researchers do a comprehensive literature review, and then we would get a better picture. So if at the end of that, like I said, that would be a very interesting question.
Right.
If the answer is like you're saying, right? If there's never been a single, if every interventional study done on fruits and vegetables has come out as not being helpful in any way, that would be a very significant finding.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah. Okay. So looking forward to that. Describing your diet, it's been very clear that you've been doing it in a much smarter way than a lot of the other people doing this kind of diet. Right. And so I think that's something very significant because when I look at your diet, I actually don't think there's a lot of issues there. And soon we're going to talk about your lab markers. And given what you're telling me, I would expect that your lab markers would be pretty good, because not only are you getting enough nutrients, you're also combining this with intermittent fasting, which could be helpful in various ways. And you're not consuming a high protein diet. You're consuming a lot of fat, which I think is helpful. Really, every aspect of how you're conducting this diet, I think is good. And I'm a fan of that. My concern is that a lot of people are not conducting the diet in the way that you are.
Yes. And that's one of the things, that's what I'm trying to do. And that's why I appreciate having platforms like this to talk to people about how to think about doing a carnivore diet, because I think that elimination diets are very helpful to people. And whether they are lectin elimination diets or oxalate elimination diets, I think people need to know that elimination of some plant foods or all plant foods can be very valuable, but we have to do it in a very intentional way. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to share with people what I believe is an evolutionarily consistent way of eating a carnivore diet that is nose to tail, and that is counting. And I love thinking about this, is accounting, where do I get this and where do I get that? And I think that there are lots of interesting arguments in the carnivore community. Do we need as much of that? But I just prefer to say, hey, if you eat nose to tail, you can even get the RDAs of all these things. And then I'm also going to go on the back end, and we can talk about my labs and check and make sure that all these things are looking okay in myself, because I'm a scientist, I'm a physician. I don't want to recommend this to people unless I feel comfortable saying, hey, well, I've done an exhaustive experiment in myself. And I have access to things that a lot of people don't have access to, blood work and all these things with ease. So let's do it for me and see how I feel and do my stuff and try and be as reasonable as I can and say, hey, if this elimination of all plant foods is really valuable for people, especially people with autoimmunity and other issues, then let's make sure we can construct it as intentionally as possible. And then hopefully it becomes less difficult than it seems at the beginning. It's a little bit of it takes a little bit of work to say, okay, I'm going to eat whole, I'm going to eat the whole animal. I'm going to eat nose to tail. How do I do that in today's world?
Yeah, we're on the same page with regard to that. I think, I agree with your outlook on that. Now, one question I have is, did you ever do a reintroduction, right? So let's say you're on this carnivore diet. Have you ever tried to reintroduce one thing at a time and seen which vegetable maybe is causing you problems, which fruit is causing you problems, or you were just like, I did this approach and I fixed my issue. I'm not going to go back and try a bunch of things with regard to adding in fruits and vegetables?
I absolutely think that people could do that if they wanted to. Based on all the research I've done, it's not something that's incredibly appealing to me. I could probably figure out which things are triggering me more than others. But as we can talk about, or as I've talked about on other podcasts and in my sort of literature that I present to people on my social media and stuff, in my opinion, there are lots of toxins in plant foods. And I don't want to reintroduce something with oxalates, and I don't want to reintroduce something with an estrogenic polyphenol. And I don't see a need to introduce those things. So definitely I work with people who say, I would like to introduce plants. And I say, okay, that's fine. Let's do that. Let's see if we can trigger this. Let's see if we can figure out what it is about this, which is most triggering to you. But for me, and again, this is my opinion, I'm a little bit biased because I'm deep in this, but I kind of feel like, well, why would I? I mean, I'm eating, in my opinion, the best foods on the planet. I think this is the optimal way for a human to eat. I don't miss anything about the plant foods. And I think we differ in opinion on this slightly, but I don't believe I'm missing any benefit from the plant foods that I'm not eating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we have a slightly different personality approach in how we go about this. I mean, you seem like a very curious person, and I'm a curious person as well, where I want to figure out which exact foods am I sensitive to? What do I think within the foods is causing me a sensitivity? And how can I biologically manipulate the pathway that is being altered from that food? And are they different, right? And so I think in answering these questions, we can really answer a lot of other questions for a broader amount of people, right? Because the carnivore diet is great for people like me and you, or some version of it, right? But the fact is that most people are not willing to be on a strict diet like this for the rest of their life. And I've had clients who are like, look, I don't even want to have kids because I don't want to put them through this, right? It's just, they're suffering. They can't go out with their friends. And I think there's a lot of ways to mitigate it, right? But at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to have a more expansive diet. If you went traveling for 6 years, imagine going traveling now with trying to get your duck eggs, from your organic farmer and your grass-fed beef, and while you're in the middle of the jungles of Africa, right?
Well, but I think that traveling presents a problem no matter what your diet. If I weren't eating this way, I would be eating, like a low lectin organic paleo. And I would argue that's even more difficult because right now I can get most of the nutrients I need from a few foods. I could almost distill my diet down to like meat and liver for a few days and be fine. Or for a few days, I would be fine just eating good meat. Or I could even just fast for a few days because I'm primarily a fat-based metabolism. So I would argue that I've thought about this a lot. It actually feels easier to me. When I was eating a lot of foods, I almost felt like, man, if I go to Costa Rica to surf, like I'm not going to be able to eat organic, number one. Okay, that's not the biggest thing in the world, but like, I want to eat like all these different plants, and like I can't get all those plants, but there are some plants I don't want to eat. I mean, I think eating low lectin would be harder than eating a nose-to-tail carnivore diet in Costa Rica. The only thing I would probably have to bring to Costa Rica would be maybe some liver jerky or some desiccated liver pills. I'm sure I can get reasonably good quality meat. I suspect that in most of the countries that I travel to in the world, they're hunting and, they have animals, and a lot of other places in the world, they're eating nose to tail. I mean, if you go to a market in Costa Rica, you can definitely get animal fat. You can definitely get liver and kidneys. So that's actually easier for me than getting like low lectin foods, low lectin plants at least.
I think there's a lot of issues with plants, especially grains and beans. I don't think there's any low lectin grains or beans.
I don't think so either.
I mean, even if it's low lectins, it's probably high in something else. So
oxalates.
I personally don't consume any grains or beans, even if I pressure cook it and it's low lectins. It just happens to be that the foods that are high lectins, they often come with other things, and even if they're low in lectins, because you pressure cook them, you're still not getting rid of the other stuff that's bad for you. But yeah, I'm on the same page with, if you're traveling, trying to just consume, staying away from as many bad foods as possible. What I'm just saying is that I've had experience with people, and again, if you're talking about people who are in the Reddit carnivore diet group, then that's a different question. Probably half of that, this is a very committed group, but there's maybe 6,000 people or whatever. Once it goes to the masses, it gets quite hard for the masses to, like, the masses can't even get rid of, their Entenmann's donuts, right? They can't get rid of their McDonald's. They can't get rid of a whole bunch of stuff. You're going to, how many people can really get rid of all of these things? I think you have to be a certain type of person to be able to do this. And almost every person who meets me says, I've never seen someone with more willpower. Like, how are you not eating all this stuff here, right? And well, I don't even have that much willpower.
Yeah.
That's the crazy thing. I'm looking at you. I'm like, this guy's even more, he's got way more willpower than me.
I think we're mixing a couple of questions there, because sometimes people will criticize a carnivore diet and say, no one will do that diet. And I will say, there are thousands of people who will do this diet. And it has to do with just the motivation, and I think that people bring a unique motivation to food choices. And I think if people are sick or this diet resonates with them, they will easily do it. It's quite sustainable. It's very palatable and enjoyable to eat animal foods. There's no question about that. Most people really like animal foods, and people that don't like animal foods, it's usually people who have, memories of them, or they are ethical things about animal foods. That's a whole different discussion. So the question for me is not about the scalability of it. One of the mistakes I think we often make in medicine is trying to force things on people. I am not about forcing a diet on anyone. In my practice, throughout my experience, if somebody doesn't want to make dietary changes, I can give them the best, most eloquent argument in the world, and they won't do anything. This is like with smoking. If somebody doesn't want to quit smoking, who am I to tell them to quit smoking? It's their life. They get to make that choice. So it's not about convincing anyone to do anything. I'm not trying to convince anyone to stop eating Entenmann's donuts. I am super excited about just putting the information out there so that when people are ready, they find it and they say, whoa, there's this guy talking about this nose-to-tail carnivore diet. Maybe that could help my autoimmunity that hasn't been helped by anything else. And they say, oh, well, it's kind of limiting, but I think I could do it for 30 days. And they try it for 30 days and maybe they get a benefit. Maybe they don't. Maybe there's something else going on. But that's the magic for me, is I just want to put it out there. I'm not going to force it on anyone. I'm just going to walk out to the square and just put this cool piece of information there that I've tried to consider as carefully and as intentionally as possible. And whoever wants can come and pick it up and read it and say, I'm ready for this or I'm not. And I think the people that are ready can embrace it and try it and see if it works for them. And if it doesn't work for them, that's totally cool with me. They can just pass it by. But I'm just super excited about putting something out there that people can use and find benefit on when they're ready for it. And I think that's the magic, is people have to be ready for dietary changes. So the actual adoptability of it, I mean, that to me is a little bit of a straw man argument. It's a little difficult to get around that one because nobody's even, I mean, I can't even get somebody to quit smoking if they don't want to quit smoking, and no one in the world thinks smoking is good for you, or maybe one guy, but nobody else, you know?
Well, yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I totally think that, there's a lot of committed people out there, and there's a lot of people with serious issues that they will try the diet out. And I think that's a good thing, right? So the way I frame it, the way I convince people is I say, try it out for a month, right? Just try to take out all plants from your diet for a month, right? You can eat chicken, meat, and seafood for a month, right? And I'm not too worried about any deficiencies after a month, even if people are not that careful. So you try it for a month, and then you can make the decision if you want to go back or not, right? Because when people are faced with the decision of, hey, am I going to have to do this for the rest of my life? It seems scarier than it actually is once they get used to it.
Oh, I completely agree. I think of it as a carnivore cleanse or a carnivore 30, half tip to whole 30. But yeah, I mean, that's the way I'm framing it in the book that I'm writing is if you think this is interesting, try it for 30 days and then evaluate. And maybe you go back to plants and then maybe they trigger you again and you go back to carnivore. I accept that everyone is going to come to this from a different place in terms of family commitments and other things. And I'm totally okay with people reintroducing foods if they want. I think that generally, theoretically, at the top level, there's not a whole lot of nutritional benefit to that, in my opinion. We may differ on that, and we can talk about where that may be. But if people want to do that, it makes their life easier. I'm all about just helping people have the highest quality of life possible.
Right. That's great. Okay. Now, my question is, what is the hesitation against supplementing with nutrients or something else? Do you think they're harmful, or it seems like people in the carnivore community, I'm not sure exactly why, and that's why I want to get your take. It seems like there's almost an ideological repulsion to supplementing. It's like, I've got everything I need, I don't need a supplement, right? It's almost like they're insulted. And my question is, do you think that's true? And why is there a hesitation against supplementing?
Well, I think that there's a little nuance there, and we can talk about it. Generally, when clients come to me and they're on a lot of supplements, I get a little worried. As we know, supplements are not perfect. And if you look at the quality of supplements, they're generally pretty abysmal. You could create a really good supplement, but this kind of gets back to some themes we've already talked about. Most people are not going to have the wherewithal or the access to like a really good supplement. I do think that there are issues around the bioavailability of nutrients when they are in food matrix versus in a supplement. And many of the supplemental forms of vitamins and minerals are not the same forms they are found in food. So I have worries about bioavailability, absorption, potential toxicities. One example would be something like cyanocobalamin versus methyl versus adenosylcobalamin. There are a number of forms of B vitamins like folate. I don't really like folic acid. There's some literature that folic acid could even block the folate receptor. So there's so much nuance around supplementation that for me, and this is the kind of level that I'm working with the clients, I generally say, hey, I don't think you need that. Let's just eliminate it. And I've definitely seen people with problems from supplements. They have contaminated supplements. I've seen cesium or some of the heavy metal exposures from supplements. I had a guy just the other day who had a high level of tin, which we think is from supplements. So part of my personal hesitation is I don't know what's in it. I haven't seen the mass spec and I don't trust it. And so I would like to see how people feel off of it. Theoretically, I don't really have a big problem with it. I do think that you can get too much of things sometimes. There's pretty good literature to suggest that over supplementation with vitamin C is a problem. We know that in people with G6PD, over supplementation with vitamin C creates oxidative stress and can lead to hemolysis. So it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. I do see carnivores get a little indignant about supplements saying, hey, I'm already on the perfect diet. Why do I need that? And I think that's a little bit premature. I don't agree with that perspective. I do have clients that I recommend some supplements for. I have a client the other day that had quite a bit of metal contamination, a lot of lead, mercury. And I said, you know what? As you're doing infrared sauna, why don't you do glutathione for a month just to clear that out? I don't want her to be on glutathione for the rest of her life, but a short amount of time to assist her, sure. Or, I think that there are some applications for supplements, but something like a multivitamin, in my opinion, is not the greatest thing for many reasons. I just don't know all the individual things in it. I'm worried about contaminants. And then they get to the nanoparticles, things like silicon dioxide, titanium dioxide. I have real concerns that those could be causing leaky gut or at least irritation to the gut. Hydroxymethylcellulose is one of these compounds that's been shown to degrade the mucus layer of the gut. So, I mean, if you gave me 100 supplements, I probably would throw 99 of them in the garbage because I wasn't satisfied with the purity or the ingredients. So in general, that's my major hesitation. I am open to the fact that someone could bring me like the purest supplement and say, hey, what about this? And I would say, you know what? Fine, take it. That's not a bad idea for insurance, but that's pretty hard to create for people, I believe. And people have to be really intentional and work with a provider that's very savvy. I have a real problem with people just going to Costco and getting fish oil, for instance. Fish oil is widely oxidized, very poorly produced, and I think that's a real problem.
So yeah, that's interesting. My take would be that, you know, if you're getting your supplements from an unknown company, then the risk of contamination would be there. I mean, there's also a risk of contamination with food sometimes. But basically, I would say that if you're going with reputable companies, and also there's third-party testing companies that that measure heavy metals or toxins or any kind of contamination, a lot of reputable companies will test every batch that they get. And I would say personally, I'm not that concerned. I mean, if you have research saying otherwise, if you can send that after, that would be great as well.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. That was interesting in terms of trying to understand where the carnivores were coming from, you know, in terms of supplements. So would you say the carnivore diet is for everyone?
You know, I'm gonna say that I think it is, and that's sort of an evolutionary thing. And I'll qualify that statement. But it's my opinion that we evolved as carnivores, and we evolved as facultative carnivores, meaning that we probably have eaten plants throughout our evolution. But I think that if we really take a hard look at plant food nutrient availability versus animal food nutrient bioavailability, there's no comparison. And if we look at indigenous people, and I realize we're getting outside the realm of medicine into the realm of anthropology here, but I think that if we look at the way that indigenous people use animals, generally the perspective is that they eat plants when animals are not available. And that's a really interesting perspective. That's been noted in the Inuits and African tribes, and it's supported by the data around bioavailability and the richness of nutrients in plant versus animal foods. And so I think that the stable isotope studies of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens who were coexisting 70 to 80,000 years ago, they tested both of them in terms of stable isotopes, do suggest that we were pretty high-level carnivores. So I think from an evolutionary perspective, from a nutrient perspective, I think it's really written in our DNA to have a carnivore diet as our basic human diet. Now, having said that, the caveat is that it does seem that some people can tolerate more plants than others. And I think for people who tolerate plants, there's maybe not a whole lot of a downside, but for people that don't tolerate plants, I think that it's a really important thing to do this promulgation of data saying, hey, you can eat all animals, and maybe that's going to help your autoimmune or inflammatory condition resolve. Maybe that's going to be the final thing, like it seemed to be for me with the eczema. You know, that final switch was like, hey, now it turned off. But I do think there are people who can tolerate some plants. I think evolutionarily, humans are built to run on animal food, nose to tail, as the most basic food. But some people can add some plants on top of that if they want. I would argue that's primarily for entertainment, which is valid. Again, we're talking about quality of life. If that gives people quality of life and it doesn't bother them, I think that's fine. But I don't know that from my perspective that adds anything to them nutritionally. And sort of the corollary hypothesis is maybe they would feel even better without those plants. One of those things I hinted at earlier, but I didn't really talk about, and this is just my personal experience, when I stopped eating plants, within the first 3 days, I noticed an improvement in my mood. And this is one of the things I didn't even know that my mood was not as good as it could have been, but it's very difficult to describe. I've heard it described multiple times by carnivores. This is a little bit of a confirmation bias, but many carnivores will say they had more emotional resilience. They were just a little happier, more positive person when they went away from plants. Being in mental health, having trained in psychiatry, that is fascinating to me because I did not have depression or anxiety as far as I could tell. But when I stopped eating plants, it was like, whoa, like the world just got a little brighter and I'm just a little happier and a little more emotionally resilient. Like the how likely am I to honk at somebody in traffic index went way down in just a few days. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And then when I heard people talking about it, I thought maybe there's something to that. We don't have any controlled studies or any real science to back it up, but it's an experience that people have. And I think it illustrates the point that there may be things that people would have and that would improve. They wouldn't even know were there. So yeah, in my opinion, the carnivore diet is for everyone. There are no polymorphisms. There are no predisposing conditions at this point. I mean, granted, extremists in medicine, like extreme medical conditions notwithstanding, people shouldn't take, but I think that humans in general do very well. I believe that humans will do optimally on an animal-based diet. And like I said, some people can maybe tolerate more plants than others, and they can add that in as they see fit. But I do suspect that people would feel better without them.
I see. Okay. That's interesting. So let's say we had an epidemiological study that controlled for income, vitamin D levels, exercise, and smoking and alcohol consumption. What are the biggest factors in health do you think exist, right?
Right. I think that healthy behaviors, like if you're looking at the UK shopper study and they're comparing vegetarians and non-vegetarians, and the non-vegetarians have healthy behaviors, I would imagine it to be sleep quality, exercise, community, sunlight exposure, avoidance of toxins, exposure to smoking, exposure to diesel exhaust. So many things are going to play into that. But the biggest ones would probably be sunlight exposure. The problem with that, however, is that vitamin D is not always a proxy for sunlight exposure if they're taking vitamin D supplements. And
right. They're usually doing it in people who are not taking vitamin D supplements.
You have to be very careful because I don't think vitamin D is the same as sunlight, and that has been demonstrated in multiple studies.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah. But I think that the point that you're driving at here, I would sort of skip ahead to that and say, I do not think that observational epidemiology studies should be any guide for diet for the reasons that I enumerated earlier. If we look across cultures, if we look across studies that have tried to separate and do death rate ratios, we see that all these things fall out. And again, we're just looking at epidemiology. Show me the interventional studies. It doesn't show up. They just don't exist. And I guess then the idea becomes, what is the hypothesis? What are these vegetables doing? We haven't really gotten into polyphenols. We can talk about that if you want, at the risk of getting pretty granular. But I just don't believe there's any magic to fruits and vegetables. I don't. And the number of studies that suggest that to be the case that are interventional is convincing in my opinion. And we can talk about polyphenols. We kind of talked about fiber a little bit. I don't think there's any clear evidence that fiber is beneficial, because what we're presupposing there with the epidemiology is that there's something good about fruits and vegetables. Well, what is it? What is it? Because it's not nutrients. We've kind of already established that we probably agree on 98% of that. There's no nutrient in plants that's really beneficial to humans that we can't get from animals. And, splitting hairs about levels of vitamin C notwithstanding. And so what's left is fiber. And I think the case against fiber is pretty darn convincing. There's really no evidence that fiber is beneficial for humans in terms of cancer prevention, in terms of diverticulosis, in terms of any other outcome that we look at. And there's plenty of evidence that fiber creates all sorts of GI distress and lots of gas and much consternation of partners, when your partner Dutch ovens you in bed or farts and leaves stinky bombs all over the place. And then the last part of the equation is the magical polyphenols, which I think if we actually dig into the research, are pretty much just imagined fairy tales. They're just not all they're cracked up to be. And I think that has to do with a logical fallacy in the way that we're doing research on polyphenols. The idea that when we try to suggest that a polyphenolic compound, or any plant molecule for that matter, even things like sulforaphane, which are not polyphenolics per se, but are lumped into that category of like plant molecules, quote unquote, where the supplement companies will only want to focus on the beneficial part of that molecule, and they completely turn a blind eye to any other studies that are done regarding the ways in which that molecule is dangerous for humans. And no one ever talks about that because these are multi-million-dollar supplements. But if you look at some research on any molecule, whether it's resveratrol, curcumin, sulforaphane, apigenin, whatever, there's always negative stuff that those molecules do in the human body because they're from a different operating system. Why are we not surprised? But we never hear about it. All we hear is Rhonda Patrick pushing broccoli sprouts, but she never talks about all the people who are getting endemic goiter from goitrogens, or all the ways that sulforaphane can oxidize lipid particles and membranes, or the fact that the mechanism of sulforaphane is completely redundant and we can achieve optimal glutathione status by doing exercise or sunlight or cold plunge. That's the same pattern with all the polyphenols. It's just this Pied Piper saying, look at this sweet study that shows less DNA damage with this molecule. Well, nobody ever shows you the other 5 studies that say that sulforaphane competes with iodine at the level of the thyroid and is probably causing thyroid cancer in people. Nobody ever shows you that. And this is my problem with the plant molecules. They're just not magical. They're just from a different operating system, so they don't play well with humans.
Right. So yeah, I mean, this really opens up Pandora's box, right? Because I think each chemical is different, right? If you're talking about sulforaphane, it's going to be different than another chemical. And then to really tease out, like, is sulforaphane good for you? You know, that's a whole podcast, right? I'd say like a lot of these topics are a whole podcast in and of themselves, where you really need to tease out each thing. But so I think we'll shelve some of that stuff for now. But what I would like to do right now is just go through some of your labs and see if they're in the optimal range. Now, you know, based on what I'm hearing, it seems like you're a pretty healthy guy. You have a healthy lifestyle. You're doing your carnivore diet, right? And so I don't think you're deficient in many things, if anything at all. I think you're doing a lot of things right. And so I want to see what your blood tests are like, because a lot of people in the carnivore community will say, I've done my labs and my doctor said I'm great, right? But my issue is if your labs are in the normal range, often your doctor will just say, yeah, it's great. But it doesn't mean that it's the optimal range, right?
Sure.
There's an optimal and there's a normal. So I founded a company that basically people input their labs and we give them the optimal ranges for each of these things and we tell them how to get it there. And that's called labtestanalyzer.com. It's basically premised on the assumption that there is an optimal and there's a normal. And often when you do research on each lab marker, you'll see, you know, the normal range is sometimes very different than the optimal range. And for the optimal range, we're looking at what is the lowest risk of dying from any cause, pretty much, right?
Right.
That's one metric. Or just, you know, what's the lowest risk of dying from a variety of conditions, or just the lowest risk of getting conditions, even if your risk of dying is not increased overall. So yeah, that's how we find the optimal range. So can you tell us some of your labs and what the numbers are?
Yeah, I've done extensive blood work on myself. I've probably had blood drawn at least every 45 days for the last 9 or 10 months that I've been doing a carnivore diet. So generally what I do every 45 days is a CBC, a CMP. I look at inflammatory markers. I look at thyroid function. I look at as much stuff as I can from my perspective. So generally what I see, I just had blood work done the other day, so I don't have my most recent blood work. I literally had it drawn 2 days ago. But from about a couple of months ago, I have, you know, all my common chemistries. So this would be what people would consider to be a comprehensive metabolic panel. The chemistries are all within normal. And I think that probably on your optimal lab calculator, the chemistries are not particularly interesting, but if people are interested.
Actually they are. The blood chemistries are very.
Are any particular chemistries that you'd like to know about? I mean, my calcium is 9.3.
Okay, what is your white blood cell count?
So my white blood cell count, that's in the CBC. So my white blood cell count is 4.1.
Okay. 1 second, quick question. Did you do tests when you were doing the paleo diet and then tests when you were just on before any kind of diet?
I do. Those are much more distant. I'd have to look those up.
Okay. Because that would be also an interesting question.
Well, I do know that my CRP went down on carnivore. So my CRP was 1.15 at one point. My HS-CRP was 1.15 when I checked it on a paleo diet. And throughout carnivore, in 5 checks, it's been 0.3 or 0.2 every single time. HSCRP is not always the most sensitive measure, but it's always been extremely low on
Okay,
carnivore.
that's an improvement, definitely. And again, we can there's visual evidence that your inflammation went down, right?
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Because your eczema's gone.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's no question that your inflammation has gone down.
People often worry about kidney function on a carnivore diet. My creatinine is 0.95. I will note that I'm a fairly muscular individual, and so I backed that up with the cystatin C, which is 0.6,
Okay.
which is essentially the lower end of the reference range. Cystatin C is another measure that we sometimes use for kidney function when people are eating a lot of protein or when people are very muscular. So that's been very low. My kidney function has always been stable. My uric acid is 4.1. People say, oh, aren't you going to get gout eating all that meat? I did a whole YouTube video about why eating meat exclusively or, meat will not cause gout in the absence of insulin resistance or fructose or in the absence of alcohol for people. My liver function tests have always been totally within normal, and I think pretty darn optimal ranges. There's some evidence that you want your ALT to be a little bit higher than your AST. My ALT was 34, my AST was 25. We talked about my GGT, which is a measure of oxidative stress, was 13, so it's very low.
Yep, that is good.
My bilirubin is 0.6. My total protein is between 7.5 and 6.9. My albumin is surprisingly not abnormal.
What's your number?
Which one?
The
Protein?
albumin.
Albumin 4.3, 4.6.
Okay, that's good.
My thyroid function has been interesting to me. I've looked at that in detail. So my TSH is 0.787 or 0.897. My free T3 was 3.0. My free T4 was 1.1.
Did your TSH change from previously? Because a TSH below 1 is low.
I'd have
So
to look.
I'm curious.
I mean,
I'm curious why your TSH is lower and if it was different from before.
Yeah, I mean, technically the reference range for TSH is not, it's 0.4. So
Right. No, it's not necessarily out of the reference range.
Right.
I have to look at what the optimal range that we have for that is, but
generally
I know that low TSH can also be a risk factor for something.
Right. But
I'm curious if it was different before or after. Right?
I'd have to look. Yeah, it's been pretty much about that level throughout carnivore. People may not know about TSH. Generally, a high TSH is a bad thing because it means that your pituitary is working hard to get your thyroid to do things. And a lower TSH means that your thyroid is working just fine. It doesn't need as much of a signal from the pituitary. If you go too low on the TSH, we think about exogenous sources of thyroid hormone or Graves' disease, but I'm nowhere near that. But my other thyroid numbers are pretty robust. My T4, my T3, the conversion ratio, my antibodies are negative. No surprise there. People sometimes ask about hormones. My free testosterone was 4.6, and the range is nanograms per ml. And my sex hormone binding globulin was 43. And my free testosterone was 81 picograms per ml. My total testosterone was 4.6 nanograms per ml. My sex hormone binding globulin was 43 nanomole per liter.
1 second. Did you check for, let's say, a variety of nutrients in your blood? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
And as people will know, it's a little difficult to look at actual nutrients in your blood, but
It is.
serum folate was quite high. I can pull up those results. That's a different set of labs. Serum folate was high. It's robust. I mean, obviously B12 is very high.
Yeah.
My vitamin C was 0.92, which is pretty squarely in the reference range.
What was the range for that? I don't know the ranges for nutrients offhand.
Yeah, vitamin C, the reference range is 0.46 to 1.49 milligrams per deciliter.
Okay.
My vitamin E was within range. My vitamin A was 406, which is right in the middle of the range. The range from that is 300 to 650 micrograms per ml. My vitamin E I've checked as well. I'll find that. My vitamin E was 11.6. The
What
range
about
is
your
5 to
LDL cholesterol?
Yeah. So we have to have a whole discussion if we're going to talk about LDL cholesterol, right? Because
Okay.
I interviewed Dave Feldman on my podcast, and I strongly believe, and I'll have Stuart Nadolski on my podcast as well. He's a cholesterol. He thinks that a low LDL is a good thing. I think if you actually look at the literature, it is not clear at all that a low LDL is in any way protective or that a high LDL is in any way dangerous in the setting of insulin sensitivity. And so what we see almost invariably in people doing ketogenic or carnivore diets is a large rise in LDL, and my LDL is high. But
What
my
is your LDL?
HDL, my
What's your number?
HDL is also extremely high. I'll pull that one up, I'll tell you. I have done NMR multiple times for my lipids through True Health. My HDL is very high. My triglycerides are very low, as I mentioned. My my fasting insulin is very low. My fasting insulin is 2.7, which is quite low for a fasting insulin, suggesting no evidence of insulin resistance. My LDL direct is 181.
Okay.
My HDL direct, these are milligrams per deciliter. My HDL-C is 88. My triglycerides are 44. My LDL particle number is 1,835 with less than 200 small LDL-P when we're doing the NMR. My HDL particle
So what
number.
is that out of the range for the NMR? How does that? I mean, I don't have the I don't know the results offhand for the NMR.
A small LDL of less than 200 is the lowest small LDL. My HDL is 49.9 micromole
So you're saying
per liter.
the NMR was optimal.
Well, the NMR is optimal, but there's a high LDL particle number, right? So on ketogenic and carnivore diets, the LDL will rise. And I don't think that there's any evidence that this is damaging in people who are insulin sensitive. My fibrinogen was 398. My HSCRP was 0.3 at that time. So, and at the time of that test, my fasting insulin was 3 or 2.9. So the lipids are a very interesting conversation, but if you look at the data, there's a real discordance in people's LDL and their cardiovascular risk when the HDL is high versus low. And I think that the real determining factor for LDL is insulin sensitivity. And if people are insulin sensitive and doing a ketogenic diet, we are going to see a high LDL. And I would argue that is normal.
Yeah. So the thing is, I actually agree. In people who do a ketogenic diet, not everyone, some people are just genetically have low cholesterol levels. But a lot of people, including myself, especially if you're not consuming fiber. So yeah, a ketogenic or a carnivore type diet often increases LDL cholesterol.
And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's normal. And it suggests that we're doing metabolism. What we see, if we break it down, we know that desmosterol is high. So we're making a lot of cholesterol. That's normal on a ketogenic diet. We know there's a common pathway called the mevalonate pathway by which ketones and cholesterol are produced. And so if we're making ketones, we can shunt some of that ketogenic material into cholesterol. We also know that saturated fat can increase cholesterol. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. We don't have time to go down the saturated fat rabbit hole, but the epidemiology around saturated fat is pretty fascinating. It's far from clearly a negative thing in our diets. Any other specific labs that you'd like to hear about? I've done a ton.
I mean, those,
iron studies. So my ferritin was 117. It didn't go through the roof. Again, my CRP super low every time I did it.
The labs that you're mentioning, the labs that you've mentioned are all pretty much in the optimal range. I mean, the ones that, especially the numbers that I knew about, with the exception of LDL. Now, that is a conversation, but when you look at the data, I've looked at the data in terms of mortality and LDL numbers. When you go above 100, and for certain age ranges, it could be different, right? Some it's 130, but generally above 130, the mortality goes up. That means the risk. That's
No.
in the epidemiological studies.
Well, Dave Feldman just published about his reanalysis of the NHANES data, and it was the complete opposite. So I would encourage you to look this into his talk from Low Carb Salt Lake, I
Okay.
believe it was, or Keto Salt Lake. And so he got a hold of the NHANES data, which is probably the premier data set. And the problem is this: when he first looked at the NHANES data, and I talk about this in my podcast with Dave, and there are a number of cohorts that you can look at in which that does not hold true. There are a number of cohorts in which higher LDL is not associated with higher mortality. The other thing is that higher LDL has not been adjusted for HDL and triglycerides. So I'll talk about two specific analyses that have been done that are particularly fascinating. So Dave looked at the NHANES data, and the first thing that he looked at showed that as the LDL went up, people generally had higher mortality. But then he noticed by age adjustment, as you suggested, the ages also went up. So when he looked at people above 50 years old, he was able to find a subgroup of people who in the NHANES data generally had the same age distribution across LDLs. And because he suggests this in the talk, it's kind of funny, it's tongue in cheek, age is a risk factor for death, right? So when you look across LDL numbers in the NHANES data, in people who have the same age per LDL quintile, it's the reverse pattern. People that have higher LDL live longer. And then if you substratify that into people who have what he calls the triad, which is high HDL and low triglycerides, there's an even more pronounced effect, and it's a very clear pattern. So it's definitely not the case that in all epidemiology, LDL correlates with mortality. You have to correct for age. And in perhaps the largest data set, the NHANES, it's not true. And then furthermore, there was a reanalysis of the Framingham data done by Ivor Cummins, and he looked at mortality and LDL. And what he did was he was able to stratify that into people with high HDL and high HDL and low HDL. What he saw was that in people with low HDL, LDL did track with cardiovascular outcomes. So he was looking at cardiovascular outcomes, not all-cause mortality. Dave was looking at all-cause mortality. But in people with a high HDL, and I can look and see exactly what his cutoff was there was no correlation between LDL levels and cardiovascular events. So it's quite a nuanced discussion.
Yeah, this is a topic I actually did a fair amount of research on. And so what I found, and again, I would like to see the studies that you're saying. So I did find the studies that you're suggesting, which is, first of all, most of these studies will break, a lot of them will break it down by age, right? So they do take age into account, where they'll say in this age group, here's the mortality rate or whatever, right? Not everyone, but a lot of them. But there are studies that might show no effect, but I'd say those might be one out of the 100 that are showing that the higher your LDL, even when accounting for age, the higher the mortality. Now, again, some studies do show that higher LDL can even be protective at older ages, right?
And are those studies excluding people with familial hypercholesterolemia? Because that's a whole different ball of wax.
Well, again, there's hundreds of studies on this topic. So which one are you talking about, right? So it can get very complex, this conversation. And I wouldn't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I would say it's something I do want to pick up. And I do want to see the studies that you're talking about, because I want to see the number of LDL that they're saying is lower for mortality, because maybe the highest I've ever seen in a study with LDL is 160, right? Above 160, I don't think any study is showing lower mortality. But that's something that I may have missed, and that's why I would like you to send me any information that you have about that.
Yeah, again, I would just look at, it's Dave Feldman from Keto Salt Lake. He goes over all that NHANES. And there's another presentation by Ivor Cummins on YouTube that I can send you that talks about his analysis of Framingham.
What's his name? Feldman? David Feldman?
Yeah, you're not familiar with Dave? He's awesome. Yeah, Dave Feldman, yeah.
Dave Feldman. No, I'm not familiar with him. One question I have, and it might sound cynical, was he always into high-fat diets?
He is interested in high-fat diets. Yes, he is keto. He's interested in high-fat diets.
I see. Because the most interesting times I find is when a researcher has the opposite opinion and they come upon a finding and they change their opinion, right?
Are you
Whereas,
there?
often you'll see a very high correlation with someone who has a prior opinion. And this goes for every side of the debate, right? And then it happens to be that the studies that they reanalyzed
Did I
fit
lose you there?
according to their assumptions, right? It's a miracle, right? It just so happens to be the people who have a prior belief, they're more likely to come upon that idea. Now, again, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying it would be interesting if he came from the opposite ideology and then converted over, right? I still would like to see what his research is. And even though he's of an ideological spectrum of the topic that he's researching and the outcome has conformed to his ideology, I still think it's useful to see what his data is and try to learn from that and see what the numbers are. Did he have like an optimal number in terms of LDL? Because even if his numbers are higher, usually there will be an optimal range still. So maybe he'll find higher levels of LDL are optimal, in which case I would be curious about his numbers.
If you listen to him, he'll say he doesn't have a dog in the fight. He doesn't really care what it is. He just wants to understand it.
Okay.
He did a ketogenic diet. He saw his numbers rise, and so he thought that was interesting. I don't think he's not in the keto space per se. He talks in the keto space because it's relevant, but he's done so much self-experimentation. It is unreal. You should go to his website. It's called The Cholesterol Code. And he's writing a book as well. And he is not biased. He'll do like complete carb experiments where he does all carbohydrates. He is just interested in understanding how LDL moves.
That's really interesting. He's a
Yeah.
guy, he sounds like a guy I should interview.
You should definitely interview him. He's amazing. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's see. I mean, we've went through quite a lot in this podcast. I think it was very interesting, and I think it's important that people understood how your diet is and they can learn a lot from it. It was also interesting to hear a lot of your labs, the ones that I was able to figure out, except for the LDL, your numbers were in the optimal range, the ones that I was familiar with the numbers offhand. So that's really good that your labs are actually in the optimal range, because I hear a lot of times people in the carnivore diet, saying they're all great, and I'm skeptical. But in your case, your labs are with. We can talk about the LDL a different time.
I will send you an email with those studies, and I'm excited to see this post on Self-Hacked. And I appreciate that you guys have done some carnivore diet posts, and I think they could help a lot of people. So I appreciate you guys talking about it. It's a good conversation. Yeah, I'm sure that you and I will have lots of exciting discussions in the future.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're both trying to find the truth, and I mean, even though we have our own positions on certain things, I'm always ready to change my position if I see the evidence. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it is kind of where there's a lot of vague or not hardcore evidence for things, but there's often a lot of it, right? So you could have a lot of epidemiological studies, even though there's flaws in epidemiology. So it comes down to what is our viewpoints of how much do we weigh certain kinds of evidence. I think that's a very big factor, right? Do we say that if this epidemiological study says this, then there's a 50% chance this is true, or maybe there's a 1%, it really only provides like 1% evidence, or very, very minute, that it's not even significant, right? So there's kind of a larger philosophical kind of question that you have to ask as, what kind of evidence do you support?
Yeah, and I think the context of all that's really important. And I love that we can have the dialogue and help people understand that epidemiology is not the same as interventional studies.
Yeah. But, if I were to take the devil's advocate position for the carnivore diet, there's absolutely no clinical trials or intervention trials either, which is obviously a big flaw in terms of saying that there's benefits. Now there's anecdotal studies, right? Or anecdotal evidence
And case reports.
and case reports and certain very small trials. It's usually like on a ketogenic diet or something like that. And look, I'm a believer because it helped me, a type of diet that's similar to this. But I think in order for it to become more widespread, people can always say like, show me the evidence, right? Oh, what are all these anecdotes? It's nonsense. These are just crazy people.
Right. And I think that that's the next step. I think we want to get together, maybe you can help us with this. We want to get a GoFundMe, and get 15 or $20,000 together and do a pilot trial. I think it would be super easy and look at some really basic risk markers and people even maybe get diabetics or people with, we could look at some really basic markers with a carnivore diet and show people that they're not going to get liver failure, their kidneys aren't going to explode. And just so we get some pilots, some pilot data. I mean, it's not rocket science. If we put somebody on a carnivore diet, we're going to see an improvement in blood glucose. But, we prove it to the medical community, and then we get more and more people studying it because people now are starting to study ketogenic diets in the way that I hope people will study a carnivore diet in the next few years. And of course, I think that they will have to do a nose to tail carnivore diet or a carnivore diet with, supplements or organ complexes to make it more doable for people. But I hope that in 4 or 5 years, there are as many studies with carnivore in the works as there are studies with ketogenic diets.
I have the same hope. I would really like to see, these things be studied formally, and because I do think there's a lot of benefits especially to specific parts of the population, and, just to get the conventional community on board would be a good thing.
That would be a fantastic day, my friend.
Okay. How would people find you? What are you working on? Is there anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've got a podcast, which is called Fundamental Health with Paul Saladino, MD. I've referenced that a couple of times on the show. I interviewed Dave and interviewed a bunch of people, and that's my project right now. It's not a completely carnivore podcast. Obviously, I'm a huge proponent of the carnivore diet, but I interview people who are not carnivores and just want to try and understand health and the roots of disease in general. And as I've said before, I try not to be tied to an outcome. It's impossible as humans. We get biased and things are tribal. But, if you or anyone else could show me evidence that really suggested that plants had a unique value, I would go back to eating them tomorrow. I just want to understand what's best for me and my family and my patients and help people achieve optimal health. So Fundamental Health is my podcast. My website is paulsaladinomd.com. I have a newsletter there people can sign up for, and I try and share a lot of good stuff in that. I also have a YouTube channel, which is paulsaladinomd.com, and I'm on the social media realms. Instagram is Paul Saladino MD. Twitter is MD Saladino. I will also mention that I have a private practice in Southern California. I see patients privately, in person, and remotely throughout the country and the world if people want to work with me as a functional medicine doctor. I'm also writing a book. It's called The Carnivore Code: Unlocking the Secrets to Optimal Health by Returning to Our Ancestral Diet. So that'll be out in a few months. That's what I got going on, man. Lots of exciting stuff. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it was great talking to you, and I look forward to communicating about certain topics that we hit upon. All right. It was great talking to you, and we will be in touch.
It sounds great. Thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.